And we're recording, and we are not quite live today, unfortunately. However, we have an amazing special guest. Oh, I shouldn't have said special guest. I should have said Jared and made the joke where it's like, oh, Jared's joining me today.
Hi, I'm Jared. I've got an orange beard now, but otherwise I'm the same.
To be fair, though, you do have some resemblance to Jared with the beard and, the headphones. But do you mind just introducing yourself, your name, your role here at Adventist Media, and just a bit about yourself?
Yeah, all right. So my name's Ryan Stanton. I'm one of the newer sort of members of Adventist Media. I work as an editorial assistant at Signs of the Times, where I spend a lot of time sort of writing articles to put up online that are about current events that don't necessarily fit the, lead time that a magazine requires. And I also work on making some of the older content a bit more updated to be easier to find online, things like that. When I'm not working here, what I do is I study. I'm starting a PhD in June, July, sort of end of June, start of July, and that is going to be looking at the intersection between podcasts and gaming content creation.
Yeah, wow. So for everyone tuning in, you've probably read the title of this video, which is all gaming and Adventists approaching gaming and all that. So Ryan really is he doesn't call himself an expert, but I think compared
aspiring expert. Hopefully 3 years and a doctorate later, I might be an expert in part of the field.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to have you on the show today, Ryan. Thank you for joining us and for your willingness to, I guess just share a bit of your knowledge / almost expertise in the area. But I guess what I wanted to explore today is kind of not the intersection between podcasts and gaming, but the intersection between Adventists and gaming and sort of how we approach. We've kind of talked about this on Record Live in the past. I had a conversation with Jared about how we approach media and sort of media literacy. And I think this kind of goes down that path. But yeah. I know that there will be a lot of parents or maybe siblings or maybe grandparents or people watching that may have concerns about the kind of games their kids are playing and all that kind of stuff. So it's a big topic today. But before we dive into that, Ryan, aside from working here at AM, which you do an amazing job, and we're very, very lucky to have you on the team and your studies, we also go to the same church, and we've been friends for how long have we been friends for now?
So I came to Sydney in 2016, so it probably would have been around then. I think one of the first events I went to at Wahroonga, one of the first big social events was, I think, your 21st, it might have been.
Probably, yeah. Wow.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Or not, if you don't want your age known. In that case, it sounds completely wrong. But no, I remember that was one of the first things. I remember a joke was told about my and your relationship, in that we almost got in a car accident once. And
not my proudest moment, nearly killed you.
And it was very strange for me because I hardly knew everybody here, but everybody was cracking up at this joke like we were great friends, and it was weird, but it was welcoming.
A bonding experience.
Yeah.
Aside from the fact that I nearly died.
Hey, look, there are worse drivers in the youth nowadays. That's all I'll say.
That is true. Thank you for that backhanded compliment. I will take it. And aside from attending Wahroonga Church with me, you've got quite a big family. So Stanton, your last name, some people watching may be familiar with. Do you mind elaborating a little bit?
Yes. So my grandparents' generation, Harley Stanton and Judith Stanton are my grandparents. They have a lot. I think one side has 10 siblings. I think Pa was one of 10, and then I think Ma was one of 8 or something to that extent. I might be getting the numbers wrong there. I was just showing my ignorance, but large. Ma and Pa only had 2 kids, my dad and Uncle Dean, but then it blossomed out again when my dad and mum had 6 kids. So I'm the 4th of 6. I am the youngest boy, and then there is 2 younger girls after me. 4 boys, 2 girls.
Yeah. So you've all dispersed across Australia and you're all studying and doing your own thing now?
Yeah, it's actually their first year as empty nesters. My youngest sister just moved up to Avondale. She's doing a diploma in outdoor rec. Me and one other brother and his wife are in Sydney. One brother and his wife are up Queensland, Gold Coast, Brisbane sort of area in between them. And then there are two in Melbourne.
Wow.
So yeah, they're enjoying the time. They've started ballroom dancing. Dad is dad pilots recreationally, so he's building a plane in his garage. He has been for the past decade, but now with all of us gone, he actually has time to work on it again. Yeah,
that's very cool. So you're graduating in about a week or so, is that right? And your parents
yeah, Tuesday. So when this goes live, I will have graduated 2 days ago.
Yay, congrats, very cool. And what are you graduating from exactly?
So I went to University of Sydney. I started doing teaching. That's not important. I mentioned it. I quickly transferred into a Bachelor of Arts, Media and Communications, which is basically the sort of journalism, radio, broadcast stuff degree. From there, I did all that, and then I decided to do an honours year. So I am graduating first class honours in Bachelor of Arts, Media and Communications, which I'm sure you could probably find a degree with a couple extra words on there, but that was enough for me.
Yeah. So in your studies, Ryan, did you have much to do with gaming? Because you wrote an article in Signs of the Times about this topic that we're about to discuss. And you've kind of come in, you mentioned the opinions of experts and things like that. And I know in your personal life as well, you're quite the gamer. So did you study this because you kind of like it in your personal life? Like, what's the intersection?
Yeah. So it is a bit that I didn't initially do the degree to study this sort of stuff. I did the degree to get into journalism and writing and broadcast and the sort of stuff I'm kind of doing at Signs to an extent. And I did it, and I quite enjoyed that. I've always been, I suppose you could call me a gamer to an extent in my personal life, though studying it, you'll find that there's a lot of contention about that term, which I think is a topic for another podcast probably, or sorry, not podcast, show.
Live, yeah.
But to get back to it, one of the electives I did was there was the digital cultures field in the degree, and I did an elective in digital cultures that was called Games and Play, which wasn't strictly about video games. It was about all forms of games and all forms of play, but it's a big part of society nowadays is that through video games, so it was focused a lot on that. I really loved the subject. I thought it was really interesting. I really loved the teacher, and then next semester when I was doing another subject, they were talking about potentially doing honors and doing something you loved, doing it about something you enjoy, researching something that you're fascinated by. And look, I'm showing my nerdiness here. I was like, oh, I could do that, or I could do comics. And I had an idea for a comics thesis. I decided not to do that, decided to go with the gaming one. I sort of got not the guy who taught that course, but a different person to be my supervisor. And I did my honors studying not video games actually, but tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons or those other scary, potentially satanic games, and how people make shows out of them nowadays and broadcast them online. And I studied the audiences of that for my honors thesis. And that sort of led to, hey, maybe I'll do a bit more of that for my PhD.
Yeah, wow. So there's a lot to explore. I'd love to explore the whole satanic games, a little bit of what you just said in there, but we will get to that in a second.
Yeah, sorry, I gave you a lot to go up there. Let me just recap real short. Did an elective about games, loved it, decided to do my honors about games, and that's leading to me now doing a PhD in the field.
Yeah. Awesome. So there's all kinds of games, and I know being your friend, you play like video games and you play tabletop games with other friends of mine and all that kind of thing. I think often the temptation as Adventists or as people who are like thinking about the dangers of gaming or whatever is to sort of put them in different categories. There's like Monopoly and that's harmless, and then there's like shoot 'em up games and that's bad and that sort of thing. Can you like pull apart sort of the different categories of games? I don't know much about games myself, but I know there are games where you're like first person and not first person. There's all kinds. Is there some sort of general, I guess, definitions you can provide for this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So there are some sort of broad definitions. It is important to understand as well, though, when you're talking about games, they are never just one thing. They are always combinations of them and stuff. So even the broadest categories are occasionally faulty. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'll give some broad ones. The big three that I would probably distinguish sort of just a bit more generally is, I would say, you have your digital games or video games, which are, games that are played on a computer or on a console or some form of technology that sort of uses it's like an interaction between you and the computer, and the computer sort of mediates the action, and you do that. Then I would say there are board games, which can range from something very straightforward and simple like Monopoly. I would also sort of put card games like in this category, or it might be a bit more complex like Catan, or if you're somebody who's like really into games, you might be talking about like a Pandemic or some other game that nobody knows the name of. Me and some friends are playing one called The King's Dilemma at the moment, which is very fun. Wow. Nobody would have heard of it. That big broad field, I would just sort of, for the purposes of speaking just casually about it, I'd say board games.
Yeah.
And then I would also say there's the sort of third type, which is where my study was, which is similar in that they don't involve computers. They're about playing with friends and stuff. Board games are mediated by the game, and there's a sort of physical game you play with a lot of the time. Then you get a bit more abstracted and you get to tabletop role-playing games, or TRPGs or TTRPGs, or whatever you want to call them. That's your games like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, where it's oftentimes people describe it, and it's a simple one that would probably help as sort of like shared storytelling, collaborative storytelling. And that's where, you have multiple players. One person sort of runs the game and sort of creates the world, but then other people are playing as characters and they're saying what they want to do in this world. And then, you're rolling dice to determine how successful you are and how that goes and everything like that. So those are the three broad categories. And then I would also say the other thing is games have genres, in the same way that movies have action, thriller, romance, and sometimes they're a mixture of them. Games have that. So games will also have those categories, but games will also oftentimes be described by genre based on how they play. So, for example, role-playing games, as I mentioned, tabletop role-playing games are part of that. There's also digital role-playing games, which sort of are very similar, but use the computer in place of the person directing the game. And the computer is the one that goes, all right, let's see how well you did. We'll do this. Oh, you did poorly. We'll do that sort of thing. Okay. Then there's platformers is probably another one that many people know. Platformer is Mario. You're jumping from platform to platform to platform.
That's my kind
of game. Yeah. Or racing, Mario Kart, but also Forza or Gran Turismo, if those names mean anything to anybody, like more realistic simulation games.
Yeah. So I'm sure that some people watching are hearing these terms and these categories of games, and like the little red flag is kind of waving in the background, and it's like, ooh, like Ellen White talks against the movies, and it seems that society these days is mostly okay with movies now. But if she wasn't okay with movies, then surely she wouldn't have been okay with games if they'd existed, right? And I think there's certainly an argument to be had that, video games can cause violence, video games can pollute the mind, video games can be distracting. What would you say your experience has been personally, Ryan? And do you have any kind of evidence to say that that's not the case, or is the case?
So there's two parts there. Firstly, I would say, I would push back against the idea that video games cause violence and, video games pollute the mind, or games more generally even, right? The research shows that they are no more polluting or anything like that than, any other form of media. And, as we are saying, Ellen White has concerns about movies and whatnot, and sure, there are concerns that you can have potentially over these things. I have a few concerns, which I imagine we'll get to later, not about those topics, but other important topics that I think, especially parents teaching kids should be aware of.
Mm.
But video games often get singled out as uniquely violent, uniquely polluting, or even another big one is uniquely addictive.
Right.
Research does not back that up. More personally, I would say that I definitely think that there are people, and you can, to an extent, form an unhealthy attachment to games to an extent. That's less the games. That's not the games. That's oftentimes other problems, underlying problems, or other situations, and that is something. I'm probably phrasing this inelegantly, but that is something that game scholars, game studies people often point to look not at these games as unique in that they might cause problems for people, but those are oftentimes sort of symptoms of something else.
So
that's
to clarify, would you say, like, in the same way that we can be addicted to social media or to food or to whatever, this is the same kind of thing?
Yeah, 100%, right? So like, yeah, I was going to sort of talking more personally, right? Like, I'm somebody who's suffered from depression at times, and sometimes you know when you're depressed, sometimes people with depression won't get up out of bed all day. They will stay, you know, if it's a severe sort of case, they will stay in bed all day and they won't, you know, want to do anything. In the same way, somebody suffering from depression might just want to play games because, like bed, it feels like an escape from the world and an escape from having to deal with things. You know, that's not games being addictive. And that's not me blaming that person for depression either. It's a complex thing, I'm well aware, but you know, it's something that might be used in conjunction with other things in relation to this complicated issue.
Absolutely. So you were going to say, like, that was the first part of your argument. There was like a second part, or did you already get to that?
Well, the second part was that you know, it is you asked how is it personally, and I would say that personally I have actually had you know, some great experiences, and it has been quite helpful when I've been dealing with tough times. I wrote an article about this for Science, and one of the comments on that article was, you know, games are some of the only things that have been keeping me sane during the pandemic. And to sort of do a more personal one of that, as I mentioned, I'm not sure if I explicitly mentioned, one of my brothers lives in Melbourne. During the lockdown last year, him and his mates, a lot of lockdown, a lot of difficulty. Every night, practically, I would jump on a game, I would play some games with them, I would chat with them. And it was actually, you know, it was a great way for both them to keep in touch with each other, but also me to keep in touch with them and sort of create and connect with a network. That's something which can sometimes go under-examined or ignored when you comes to discussing games, that you can build great communities and great relationships as a result of these things.
Absolutely. I guess that kind of relates to another question I have in my mind about sort of how we compartmentalize our lives. And I think a lot of people would put, you know, leisure activities in one category and your job in another category and whatever. But fundamentally, I think a lot of Adventists at least would see gaming as incompatible with faith. It's like, why are you playing the video game? Of course you're going to be, you know, depressed, or of course you're going to be, you know, struggling with whatever, because your mind is being polluted, as I guess we kind of not really dived into that a lot, but your mind's being polluted, so you should read your Bible, or, you know, you shouldn't be gaming, you should be at Sabbath school, you shouldn't be gaming, you should whatever. I think we often separate those things. Is there any way to sort of reconcile that at all? Or do you kind of understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying there. I think that it's similar to reconciling with other forms of media, right? As well. It needs to be an aspect of, you know, there probably needs to be an aspect of moderation to it. There needs to be a critical analysis of what are we doing and what are we getting out of it. But you know, I think that the idea that, because oftentimes the idea that you're talking about there comes under the assumption that sort of things that we are doing in our leisure time are entirely unproductive and do not bring anything back into other aspects. And I think that that's a misconception. I don't think that's accurate. I think especially, and to link back to other forms of media and stuff. I think sometimes these things are things which a lot of people in everyday life discuss and talk about, and they can be bridges that we can use to connect to people. Everybody nowadays has watched at least one Marvel movie or something. And I don't necessarily think that in itself explicitly is going to lead to a great profound discussion about the nature of the soul and resurrection and why we have the answers or whatnot. But it's going to help you connect with them. It's going to provide some common ground. It's going to provide a place to start a friendship, and those sorts of things are important, because for me at least, I believe that when we're talking to people and when we're informing people about God and sort of allowing them to understand him so they can make the decision for themselves, you need to do that through genuine relationships. And I think that leisure activities can be a great tool in helping with that. And
yeah, it seems quite normalizing. Jared wrote an editorial a couple of months ago. He's here, but he's not, in spirit, where he kind of discussed this and how he likes sports, and he can talk to people about sport that he'd usually have nothing in common with. And that's kind of like a diving board for other conversations. And I suppose from what you're saying, it just clicked in my mind, it can be potentially a much stronger testimony if you can play games and you understand like that language and you're friends with people and you connect with them, but you have self-control, or you lead a sort of a life that people want to live, you're a positive person or whatever, then if you completely avoid that altogether and write it off as being a bad thing and judge them for that, like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and the other thing that I would add that comes from a danger in writing them off is, not always the case, but like with other forms of media, these are areas where issues of faith and issues of philosophy more generally and ideas are being tackled. One of the games I played at the start of the year was one that I'd played years ago, but I'd got as part of a collection for Christmas, and I thought I'd replay it. It was called Bioshock Infinite. I wouldn't recommend it. It very much falls into the category of shooting a lot of people and whatnot. But it's trying to tell a story, right? And it's interesting because this story was, well, not only was it attempting to engage with sort of things like America's history of racism, which I think is an important issue, not just America, but worldwide and Australia. But like those sorts of topics are important issues that we as Christians should have perspectives on. Not only was engaging with those sorts of issues in probably a poor manner, which is partly why I can't recommend it, but it was also very much engaging with sort of the role of Christianity and faith in the evolution of Western cultures like America and Australia, I suppose, though not explicitly. And so that's sort of interesting. But even more, this game was actually quite interestingly concerned with the concept of baptism and being born again and renewed, and whether that makes you a new person. And look, I don't think it did it perfectly. Again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing it, but maybe go online, read a little bit about it, because I think it actually, when you read what the plot sort of is and what it's trying to do, I think it was quite an interesting representation, if slightly imperfect, of the idea of, we are dead in Christ and born again. The story kind of functions as one big metaphor for that. I'm not sure if it's intentional or not, but the fact that it can sort of be read that way, and these games are engaging on these issues, this was, maybe a rare example, especially in terms of big games that we often think about when we think about games.
Yeah.
But those issues sort of can be touched on in certain aspects.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'd like to push back a little bit on that and see what your thoughts are. So as third generation Adventist, fourth generation, whatever you want.
I don't know, at least that, fourth probably.
Whatever the generation is. What I'm trying to say is you've got a fairly strong foundation for your faith. You sort of know what you believe, you understand concepts like baptism, like being born again, like the great controversy, all this stuff. So you're going into this game with these themes as like a case study, right? In this game, there's lots of themes in different games, understanding that. And so you're like, oh, that sort of reminds me of that, and oh, that's cool, you know, this is sort of Christian-esque. But for someone maybe who doesn't have the same worldview as you, or maybe does but isn't as sure about it, is that then a concern that we should be worried about? You know, parents or whatever, and trying to limit certain games for certain people?
So there are two aspects here, maybe three.
Okay.
Firstly, this game was perhaps not the perfect example in that it was quite unique in that it was literally explicitly dealing with baptism and Christianity and stuff.
Yeah.
But to answer your question of other games, which sort of we might read things into that as being sort of implicitly part of it. I think that it is understandable that we might be picking up those things, even if they're not necessarily in there or intentionally in there. I still think that we can discuss them through that lens with people, though. I still think that that provides the opportunity to. And thirdly, I would definitely agree with your point in terms of like parents worrying what their kids are playing and whatnot. I think that worry can oftentimes be overstated and it can be directed at the wrong things. But I think it is good to understand, and I don't think it is a bad thing to, you know, want to make sure that your kids are not playing something that is not suitable or does not align. There are resources to help with that. The first and most obvious is the rating system. You know, like ratings are there for a reason. You probably should not be letting your younger kids play Call of Duty if, you know, if they're asking. You know, those games are quite graphic at times, and you know, they attempt to tackle questions of what America's role in the world is like in those sorts of things. And those are things that shouldn't really, you know, they're not really what you want your 13-year-old to be playing, because they're not going to be able to understand what it's trying to go for, whether you agree with what it's going for or not, right? They don't have necessarily the capacity to deal with those issues. And so until you think they're prepared to, you probably shouldn't, sort of thing. Another one that I will give a quick shout out to is, I'm not sure if it's explicitly faith-based or not, but there is a website called Adventist Media, which is quite good. You get some free articles a month, and then it's a subscription sort of thing, but it's quite good in outlining, not only in terms of like, did we like this game? Did we think it was good? It does this for movies and stuff as well. But not only like, what did we think of it? You know, 6 out of 10, 10 out of 10 or whatever, but also going like, this is sort of what the sexual content in you can expect is. This is sort of what you're looking at. This is like, it's got great positive role models. It's got great messages. Oh, it does deal with drug use, so you should be aware of that sort of thing. It covers all those sorts of topics to allow you to make an informed decision. I think the website IMDb also has, more so for movies, sometimes for games, a parent's guide, which sort of overviews that a little bit more. That's sort of a user submitted guide oftentimes, so it can be a bit imperfect. But you know, there are resources out there that you can use to sort of try ascertain what the content is in order to make sure that you're not exposing them to things you wouldn't want to expose them to.
Yeah, that's really, really great to know. And we love to be practical here in Record Live, so thank you for them. We will try and link them in the description below. Also, if you guys have any questions for Ryan about any of these things that we're talking about, do comment, because we will be replying to the comments live. We won't be here live, we won't be replying to them.
I liked that comment. That was a great one. Good job, you user that just posted that one, if you did.
Fingers crossed. So
it feels like it's live.
When you're mentioning these websites, Ryan, is that what you mean by critical analysis of games, or is critical analysis something deeper? I want to make sure we get that right.
I think those websites are part of critical analysis and critical discourse, but I also think, you know, critical analysis, like, I haven't watched, I'll admit, I'm sorry, I haven't watched the Record Live you were talking about earlier, but you know, sort of when you're talking about movies and books and other things, it's you can get very similar critical analysis, because games nowadays are increasingly sort of telling stories and trying to say things. So you should be using, there are different aspects of the rhetoric, of course, because they use different tools to tell their stories. But a lot of the time you can be looking at what story is this telling? What is it trying to say, both sort of literally and implicitly in terms of underlying messages? How is it trying to say that? Is that effective? Is it not effective? Do I agree with it? Do I disagree with it? Those sorts of things are important, I think, to understand when we're looking at games. And of course, look, not all games are necessarily trying to do that. Some games are, Mario Kart isn't trying to say much. Mario Kart is trying to create an environment where you can have some fun with your friends and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that's definitely, on its own merits. I like having fun with friends. I think having fun with friends and providing outlets to relieve stress and connect with people is good. And so it fills that role well. But then, looking back at your Call of Duty, for example, right? Like, Call of Duty tries to say stuff about America's role in wars and whatnot. I don't think it says it amazingly. I think it very much sort of says like, oh yeah, America does some bad stuff, but man, we save the world, don't we? And like, I don't necessarily agree with that, the ways in which it tells that message. But you when you play it, you can understand, oh, this is what they're going at. This is why they're trying to go with that.
I think what I'm interpreting at the moment is that you're saying as long as you have a healthy sense of self and a healthy understanding of what you believe, you sort of, you know your morals and you know the foundation, and maybe you just understand concepts like America's role in the war if you're going to play COD or whatever, then you're much better placed to be able to critically analyze and to make good judgments and not be negatively influenced. Is that a fair summation? Yeah.
But I don't think that's an unfair interpretation.
Okay. I guess my follow-up question would be a practical one. And that is for children, or maybe not, I don't know what the age ratings are on these games, but for younger people who are playing these games, how can parents, have those conversations with their kids? You've mentioned the rating system and all that. That's great. But it's not always that easy. You said gaming addiction's a thing. Some kids might be addicted to games. What do we do? Where do we start?
Yeah. So again, I just want to, gaming addiction in and of itself, not really a thing.
Okay. Let's talk about that. Why is that not a thing?
Well, so there is research that shows that ultimately, and it sort of tested for the genres that we were talking about earlier, like multiple different types of genres and whatnot. But there was research conducted that sort of basically said, no, these are not any more addictive than anything else. Like,
oh right,
there's a quote from somebody from the University of Sydney who studies this, which I think sums it up succinctly. We wouldn't call someone addicted to books just because they wanted to read another chapter of Harry Potter after bedtime. If you're Adventist, you might not be reading Harry Potter as a kid, but Chronicles of Narnia, let's say, just because you want to read another chapter of Chronicles of Narnia after bedtime. But yes, to go back to your further question, earlier question of sort of what can parents be doing, I think part of it is it can help for parents to actually educate themselves on these sorts of things and properly educate themselves, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of sort of misinformation or misconceptions about it out there at times. One of the reasons that prompted me to write this article for Science was Four Corners released a report recently about video game addiction. And not just that, also other things called microtransactions and loot boxes and things like that in video games, which that is one of the genuine sort of concerns which we can dive into.
Oh yeah.
But this report, was very much focused on, generalizing and to a certain extent stereotyping a lot of behaviors which sometimes can be positive, such as the social interactions that I mentioned, as negative. And it stigmatized, it sort of used language relating to addictions and stuff to stigmatize their relationships in those social groups, which can sometimes be positive. And this wasn't just about kids, it was about people that were older as well. And so I think it's kind of important for parents to actually understand what these games are and why kids appreciate them and what they do and what they get out of them. there's a disconnect between what kids are playing for and why they enjoy them and what parents think they are and what's happening oftentimes. And I think it's important to bridge that disconnect, I would say.
Okay. There's two things I want to talk about. I want to go back to that, like loot boxes or whatever.
Yeah.
Actually, let's start there. For parents who want to be educated, this is probably important for them to know, I imagine. Is it microtransactions? Is that the other thing?
Yeah. So loot boxes are a type of microtransaction. Microtransactions is the big thing. There's a lot of different types, but basically it sort of refers to, and when I describe this, it might ring some bells in your head. It might put up a little red flag or a warning. It refers to basically any sort of small transaction made in a game after purchase, or sometimes if the game is free, sort of not after purchase, but after download. So these take a variety of forms. Sometimes it's like Fortnite, let's say, for example, is one of the biggest, sort of most successful games nowadays. It's entirely free to play, but you can buy a couple of things from it. Firstly, you can buy skins that make your character look cool, and everybody wants to look cool, so they will, want to pay money to get the skin that, Fortnite has everything. You can look like Batman, you can look like Captain America, you can look like other video game characters, you can look, I think you can look like soccer players or famous NFL players. Like, it has everything, right? And you want to look like one of them, so you can pay a little bit of money. It also has this thing called Battle Pass, which is basically gives you tasks to do and allows you to unlock more of those things. Like, you spend once and you unlock a lot of different skins, but then there's also the option to buy like specific individual skins that aren't on that pass, So there's a lot of different types they can do it. Loot boxes is perhaps an even more insidious example of this, where you aren't paying to buy a specific thing. You're not paying to buy, I want my character to look like LeBron James. You're paying to buy a box, a digital box that is like, you'll get 4 random items in this. And, they might all be cosmetics. One might be like, oh, you can have your name in a fancier font, maybe. Or it might be like, oh, your character can dab now, sort of thing. Like, and a lot of the rewards in there will be, mediocre, but like the LeBron James skin you might get from the loot box. So you want to keep buying the loot boxes to get, and it's not the literal LeBron James skin. I'm pretty sure Fortnite doesn't have those boxes, but those boxes are in other games. And so there is sort of these practices that are in a lot of games nowadays. And I think it's important for parents to be aware of these sorts of things and making sure that, you hear horror stories of, oh, my kid accidentally spent $300 on a game because he was trying to get, and I want to be clear, those are rare stories. That rarely happens. It's a small minority. In fact, most players, generally speaking, do not spend money on these things. It's only a small percentage of players that spend money or large amounts of money on these things. Anyway, but I think it's important for parents to sort of understand the ways in which these games design themselves to try to squeeze money out. And again, one thing that research points out is that, games aren't the only things that design practices and ideas to squeeze money out of people. There's stories of Facebook trying to use advertising to make you get money and stuff. There's Disneyland, for example. It's known that they waft the smell of cotton candy and like toffee apples through the park to try and encourage you to buy more, right? The supermarkets are very clearly designed to try and make you to spend as much money and stay in there as long as you can. You go to one aisle and you go, and I also need this sort of thing. These are techniques that are present in many aspects of society. Yeah. But it's important to understand how they are also present in games, because sometimes kids might not be aware, and it is important to understand the ways in which they are being put in there.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, this has been fascinating. You are nearly an expert. I'm just wondering, as we close, like something that's popped into my mind. Kids are very impressionable, and we've sort of explored a little bit of that, not having necessarily an established worldview, being that way. Do you know anything about games influencing sort of attention span or the way kids think, or is there any dangers that maybe that's more psychology and not necessarily game study realm? I don't know.
Yeah. So you raise an interesting point in that, like, game studies is unique because it sits at the nexus of a lot of things, and like partly why the media sometimes gets things wrong is that, like, there are game studies psychologists, but oftentimes what they'll do is they'll just go to a psychologist whose primary field is psychology and sometimes studies game sorts of thing, which is partly why they get them wrong. And I can't really comment on that, but what I can say, and what I will say that I think is important to say, is that for every game out there that you would say has a message that you don't necessarily want your kids to be exposed to, or you want them to be a bit older before they begin to tackle, there are plenty of games that deal with great issues that would be good for them. I recently played a great one called Signs of the Sojourner, which was, the entire game was about you're a kid who's inherited his mother's caravan business, and it was about that is like ancient times caravan trade route sort of thing.
Gotcha.
and it was all about forging connections and bonds with the people on the journey in the various cities and towns that you stop at, and you choose who to talk to, you make conversation with them, and there's sort of a mechanic on how you do conversation. You have cards in your hand, and each card, like, one is like an empathetic response, one is like a knowledgeable response, one is like a funny response, and you sort of choose them and match to the person to like converse. And it's an interesting example of taking games to sort of explore a way to represent the ways in which we have conversations and the ways in which we sometimes connect, sometimes we don't. And it's a tale that is a lot about building empathy to a certain extent, because you're working to connect with these people. And that's a very nice, very fun, wholesome, some might call it. Again, that's another word that when you go deep down the rabbit hole, there's a lot of discourse about that I don't need you to worry about. But yeah, a wholesome kind of game to a certain extent.
Interesting. Well, what I've sort of gleaned from this conversation is that games can be normalizing for kids, doesn't necessarily ostracize them and make them feel like they're strange or whatever. It can also socialize them. You mentioned you've made friends, and that this game in particular helped you, it can help you with social skills. What other positive benefits have we talked about?
Well, I mean, they can be fun. Like, I think, sometimes we as Christians can be focused on the mission, and we shouldn't let it distract, but can be it is important to be able to relieve pressure and relieve stress at times, and they can be great for that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I will say I kind of went into this with a bit of a skeptical view of like gaming, because like I'm not a gamer, so I'm not in this space. I haven't studied it.
Oh, you're great at Mario Kart. Don't try downplay this. You can crush me at Mario Kart. I've seen you do it.
I don't know. I haven't played in a while, but I'd love to verse you at one point.
I haven't either.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much, Ryan. You've definitely opened my mind to a lot of the positive benefits, and I guess just the general discourse around gaming and its importance and how it can sort of fit into our Adventist Christian worldview. Are there any closing thoughts you'd like to leave, maybe a practical take home for people to sum up?
Again, I really want to emphasize that it is very much, research does not put it too far apart in many ways from other forms of media in terms of its influence and its effect on kids. And so I think instead of viewing it as sort of some, uniquely different or uniquely new sort of medium, you should be approaching it as you would anything else, with a critical eye. And as a result, particularly for those sort of parents that might be watching or listening that are concerned about it with their kids, I think it's important to understand where they're coming from, engage in an honest and open dialogue about why they enjoy it, and look for the benefits that they might actually be getting, because there can be some.
Absolutely. Well, keeping the open dialogue, we hope that you guys have also gleaned something from this conversation. Please leave your comments, any questions you have for Ryan. He will be here on Wednesday, so he can type away in the comments. Also, if you'd like to read his original article, which has a lot more evidence, and like it's, you know, very long and in depth, make sure you go to signsofthetimes.org.au and just search up gaming, and I'm sure it'll come up. But thanks again, Ryan. It's been a pleasure as always. And yeah, hope you have a great week, and hope all you guys have a great week, and we will see you next time.
All right.
Bye.